What if I told you some of the most powerful military leaders in history were women? Not just leaders, but war strategists, empire defenders, and political masterminds. Yet their names were quietly erased from the global spotlight. And here's the real question. Why don't we hear about them? Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll discover warrior queens who stood toe-to-toe with empires, and one of them defeated Rome itself. Across Africa, long before colonial borders were drawn, kingdoms thrived rich in culture, trade, and power. And within these kingdoms, women didn't just exist in the background. They ruled, they commanded armies. They shaped history, but somewhere along the way, their stories were minimized, distorted, or completely erased. Today, we're uncovering that truth. Not myths, not legends alone, but documented, strategic, and powerful leadership. And pay close attention, because later you'll discover why these stories were buried and how that silence still affects what you've been taught today. Let's start with something uncomfortable. History is not always neutral. When records are missing, when oral traditions are ignored, when narratives are rewritten, what you're left with is a filtered version of truth. Many African societies preserved history through storytelling, lineage, and memory. But when foreign powers documented these cultures, they often misunderstood or deliberately reshaped what they saw. And warrior queens, they didn't fit the narrative. So they were labeled as exceptions, or worse, left out entirely. Now think about this. A woman in the 17th century, facing one of the most aggressive expansion forces of her time. And instead of surrendering, she studies them. She learns their tactics. She negotiates when necessary and fights when required. Queen Nzinga of Angola was not just a ruler. She was a strategist. She understood diplomacy, espionage, and warfare as one system. Her resistance wasn't one dramatic battle. It was a long, calculated campaign to protect her people, control trade routes, and maintain sovereignty. She adapted constantly, shifting between negotiation tables and battlefields with precision. And in doing so, she redefined what leadership looked like in a time of crisis. But Nzinga wasn't the only one. Because further north, another queen would face something even more intimidating. The Roman Empire meet Queen Amanirenas of the Kingdom of Kush. When Rome expanded into her territory, they expected submission instead. They got resistance. Amanirana led her forces into battle against Roman troops. And despite Rome's global reputation, she didn't just hold her ground. She forced them into a peace agreement on equal terms. Think about that, one of the most powerful empires in history. Negotiating with a queen they could not defeat. Now here's where it gets deeper. These queens weren't just warriors. They were nation builders. In many African societies, leadership wasn't divided into neat categories. A ruler could be a military commander, a political strategist, a spiritual authority, and a lawmaker all at once. Power wasn't boxed into one role. It was fluid. It adapted to what the moment required. And that challenges a major assumption that leadership, especially military leadership, was always male-dominated. In reality, it often depended on capability, not gender in several African cultures. Systems of governance made space for this kind of leadership. Women could rise through lineage, merit, or necessity. This wasn't accidental, it was structural. When crises came, whether invasion, economic pressure, or internal conflict, societies adapted. And sometimes the strongest leader in that moment was a woman. So if these queens were so powerful, why don't we hear about them? Here's the truth. Global education systems have long prioritized a narrow version of history, one centered on European empires, Western frameworks of leadership, and written records over oral traditions. And anything outside that lens was often ignored, reshaped, or erased. African warrior queens didn't fit the dominant narrative, so their stories were simplified, romanticized, or pushed into the margins. Not because they lacked importance, but because they challenged the way power was traditionally defined. But once you begin to uncover these stories, something shifts. You start to see history differently, not as a fixed timeline, but as layers of perspective. And suddenly, warrior queens aren't rare exceptions. They're part of a larger, richer pattern of leadership that has always existed. So here's your challenge. Don't just listen and move on. Learn the names, follow the scholars, share the stories, because history doesn't disappear. It gets buried. And it's up to us to dig it back up. One name, one battle. One legacy at a time. Now tell me, which warrior queen should we uncover next?